The morning air in New Orleans carried its usual heaviness, thick with humidity and the smell of the Mississippi River drifting through the narrow streets. By sunrise, the city was already awake. Wagons rattled over cobblestones, merchants shouted prices in French and English, and church bells rang faintly in the distance. Yet beneath the routine noise of 1844, there was an unusual current of anticipation moving through the city, quiet but electric. Word had spread before dawn that today's auction would be different. Traders whispered it in taverns the night before. Clerks murmured it while copying ledgers, and by the time the sun climbed higher, people were already drifting toward the slave market with curiosity. Burning hotter than profit, the auction house stood like a permanent scar on the city's conscience, its wooden steps worn smooth by decades of boots, shackles, and desperation. Usually, the crowd arrived loud and confident, men joking, laughing, chewing tobacco, discussing crops and prices as if they were attending a livestock sale. But on this morning, their voices were lower, restrained, something unseen hung in the air. Even the seasoned traders, men who had bought and sold hundreds of human lives without blinking, seemed unsettled. They had heard the rumors, though none of them knew the full truth. All they knew was that the woman scheduled to be sold that day was unlike any other. As the crowd thickened, planters from nearby parishes arrived in fine coats despite the heat, their LTH stitched into every seam. Wealthy Creole businessmen stood beside American-born traders, divided by accent but united by greed. A few women watched from a distance, faces tight with discomfort or curiosity, pretending they had business nearby. Enslaved people were lined along the walls, eyes lowered, bodies tense, already aware that something extraordinary was unfolding even if they did not ken. What? The auctioneer had not yet appeared, but the murmurs grew louder with every passing minute. When the doors finally opened, the usual chaos did not erupt. Instead, the crowd pressed forward in near silence, eyes fixed on the platform. Names were called, men were sold, women were sold, children were sold. The hammer rose and fell with ruthless efficiency. Prices were shouted, recorded, forgotten. Time passed, yet the audience waited, restless, as though the real event had not yet begun. Even the auctioneer seemed to sense it, pausing longer than usual between sales, glancing toward the side entrance with a tension that betrayed his practiced confidence. Then she appeared. She was not dragged or shoved forward like the others. Two men escorted her carefully, almost respectfully, guiding her toward the platform. The first shock was not her beauty, though that alone would have drawn attention. It was the way she carried herself. Her back was straight, her steps measured, her face composed. She did not look at the ground. She did not beg with her eyes. She stood as though she understood the gravity of the moment, but refused to let it break her. The crowd leaned in instinctive, as if drawn by something they could not name. Her clothing was plain yet unusually clean. Her hair was neatly arranged, not hastily tied back. These details mattered in a place where enslaved people were deliberately stripped of dignity. This woman had not been. That fact alone unsettled the buyers. Whispers rippled through the audience. Some assumed she was a favored house servant. Others used she had been owned by someone powerful, someone who had spared no expense until now. No one said it aloud, but many wondered why such a woman was being sold at all. The auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the opening bid. The number landed like a physical blow. It was higher than what many strong male laborers fetched, higher than skilled craftsmen, higher than almost any woman had ever been valued in that market. For a moment, no one spoke. Men exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. One trader laughed under his breath, assuming it was a mistake. Another shook his head slowly, as though insulted by the audacity of it. Then a voice called out a higher number. The silence shattered, bidding erupted, not with the usual aggressive confidence, but with something sharper, urgency. New bid came faster than the last, climbing at a pace that made clerks struggle to keep up. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, disbelief giving way to fascination. People who had come merely to watch now found themselves pulled into the spectacle, eyes wide as the price soared far beyond reason. The woman remained still. She did not react when the numbers climbed. She did not flinch at the thud in intensity of the room. Only once did her gaze shift, briefly sweeping across the faces before her. Some would later swear that in that single glance she seemed to recognize something about the men bidding, something they wished desperately she did not know. As the price climbed higher, the tone of the auction changed. This was no longer about ownership or labor. It had become a contest of pow. The bidders were no longer anonymous traders but recognizable figures, men whose names carried weight in New Orleans, plantation owners with vast estates, businessmen tied to shipping, cotton, and politics. Each bid was not just a declaration of wealth, but of dominance, a message sent to rivals seated only feet away. The auctioneer's voice grew strained as he repeated the numbers. His hand, TR, embled slightly as he raised the hammer again and again. He had presided over countless sales, yet never one like this. The amount now surpassed what many houses in the city were worth. Gasps escaped the crowd. Someone muttered a prayer. Another laughed nervously, unable to process what they were witnessing. Still, no explanation was given, no mention of special skills, no detailed description, a background. No justification for the price. The auctioneer offered nothing beyond the bare minimum required by law. The absence of explanation only deepened the mystery. In a world where every enslaved person was reduced to a list of attributes and flaws, this silence was deafening. Speculation ran wild. Some whispered that she was connected to a scandal involving a prominent family. Others claimed she was evidence of a forbidden affair, one that could ruin reputations if exposed. A few suggested she possessed letters or knowledge that powerful men would pay any price to control. Each theory fed the frenzy, pushing the bids higher as fear joined greed in driving the competition. As the hammer hovered mid-air, the final bidders locked eyes across the room. This was no longer about Mon. Alone. Losing meant more than missing a purchase. It meant allowing someone else to claim whatever secrets surrounded this woman. The tension was unbearable. The crowd held its breath as one final bid rang out, a number so staggering that it seemed unreal. The auctioneer hesitated, as though giving the room one last chance to object, to stop the madness. No one spoke. Slowly, deliberately, he brought the hammer down. The sound echoed through the hall, sharp and final. In that instant, history shifted. The most expensive woman ever sold in New Orleans stood silently as her fate was sealed, while the crowd erupted into stunned murmurs. Some stared in awe. Others looked away, unsettled by the sense that they had just witnessed something deeply wrong, something that went beyond the cruel. Thank you they had long accepted as normal. Even the winning bidder did not celebrate. His face was tight, his expression guarded, as though he had purchased not a prize but a burden. As the crowd began to disperse, the whispers did not fade. They followed people into the streets, into taverns, into drawing rooms and parlors. By nightfall, the entire city was buzzing with one question that no one could answer. What made that woman worth more than any other life sold on that block? And beneath that question lurked another, far more dangerous one. What secret was so powerful that men were willing to pay a fortune to keep it buried? By the time the auction ended, the question that haunted New Orleans was no longer how much the woman had cost, but why. In a city where enslaved people were catalogued like inventory, strength measured, scars noted, flaws exaggerated, her sale had broken every rule. Normally, a buyer demanded explanations before paying a premium. Was the person skilled with tools, trained in languages, physically exceptional? Yet in her case, there had been no such justification. No shouted list of abilities, no claims of fertility or obedience, only a staggering price and a silence. So deliberate it felt rehearsed. As word spread through the streets, speculation grew louder and more dangerous. In coffee houses and counting rooms, men leaned in close, lowering their voices as though the walls themselves might be listening. Some insisted she must have been highly educated, perhaps trained in reading and writing far beyond what was permitted. Others claimed she spoke flawless French, the language of the city's old elite, and English without an accent, as though she had grown up among white families rather than enslaved quarters. A few even swore they had heard she could play music, entertain guests, and move through parlors with the ease of someone born into privilege. But none of these explanations truly justified the sum that had been paid. Those who had stood close to the platform remembered details that troubled them more than her appearance. She had listened carefully to the auctioneer, as though she understood every word. She had not looked confused or frightened when the numbers rose. Instead, there had been a strange calm in her eyes, an awareness that suggested she understood exactly what was happening and why. That awareness alone unsettled C-Zone. Traders. Enslaved people were expected to be broken, terrified, or at least visibly overwhelmed. She was none of those things. Some buyers began to connect patterns they had not noticed before. She had not been displayed early in the auction, as valuable property usually was. Instead, she had been held back, sold only after several ordinary sales when the crowd was already invested and curious. The auctioneer had controlled the pacing with precision, building anticipation without revealing anything concrete. It was theater, carefully staged. And theater in New Orleans was rarely accidental. Then there was the matter of her former owner. No name had been announced, no estate mentioned. That omission was almost unheard of. Usually sellers took pride in attaching respected names to their property, using reputation to drive up prices. In her case, the absence spoke louder than any boast could have. Someone powerful wanted distance. Someone with influence had ensured that no questions would be asked publicly, that no paper trail would point backward too clearly. Rumors began to sharpen into darker theories. What if she was not being sold because she lacked value, but because she possessed too much? In a society built on rigid hierarchies, knowledge could be more dangerous than rebellion. A woman who knew family secrets, financial crimes, or illicit relationships could destroy legacies. And New Orleans was a city of secrets. Affairs across racial lines, hidden children, illegal transactions masked by respectability. A single voice, if heard in the wrong place, could unravel it all. People recalled how carefully she had been dressed, how clean and composed she appeared. That care suggested protection, hinting that until recently she had been shielded from the brutality most enslaved women endured. Why protect someone only to sell them at such risk? Unless the sale itself was the protection, unless placing her under the ownership of one powerful man was safer than allowing her to remain where too many people knew who she was. As these ideas circulated, the price began to make a grim kind of sense. The sum paid for her was not a reflection of her labor potential. It was an investment in control. Whoever owned her would own her silence, her movements, her future. The price ensured exclusivity. No rival could easily challenge it. No casual buyer could stumble into possession of whatever truth she carried. Those who had bid but lost felt an unusual bitterness, not because of money, but because of what they feared they had missed. They wondered what leverage the winning bidder now held, what knowledge could be buried or revealed at will. In elite circles, conversations grew cautious. Jokes ended abruptly when certain names were mentioned. Invitations redelayed. Trust frayed quietly. Even among the enslaved community, whispers spread. Some had glimpsed her before the auction, had noticed how overseers treated her differently, how instructions were given rather than barked. A few claimed she had once been allowed to read letters aloud, her voice steady, her pronunciation perfect. Others believed she had accompanied her former owner into spaces where enslaved people were never permitted. These stories passed quietly from mouth to mouth, growing more elaborate with each telling, until she became less a person and more a symbol of something forbidden. The city itself seemed to feel the weight of it. New Orleans thrived on spectacle, yet this sale left a residue of discomfort. The usual bravado felt forced. Men who prided themselves on rational cruelty struggled to explain why this transaction had unsettled them so deeply. It was as though the market had briefly revealed its true nature. not just as a place of buying bodies, but as a place where truth itself could be priced, negotiated, and locked away. What troubled many the most was how little resistance there had been. No one had stood up to question the price. No authority had intervened. The system had functioned perfectly, efficiently absorbing an anomaly without disruption. That realization was chilling. It meant that whatever made her valuable was fully compatible with the machinery of slavery. The system did not fear her. It knew how to contain her. As days passed, the lack of information became its own form of confirmation. No clarifying statements were issued. No corrections made. The silence suggested coordination. In a city where gossip traveled faster than riverboats, such restraint could only mean one thing. Too many influential people benefited from not knowing too much. And so the woman's price came to represent something far larger than a record-breaking sale. It became a measure of fear. Fear of exposure, fear of collapse, fear that beneath the polished surface of New Orleans society lay truths so fragile they could be destroyed by a single voice. The more people tried to rationalize the number, the clearer it became that money was never the point. The price was a signal, a warning written in gold. It told everyone watching that some stories were too dangerous to be told, and that in this city, even silence had a market value. By the end of that week, one conclusion had quietly settled over New Orleans like a thick fog. Whatever the woman knew, it was worth more than land, more than labor, more than life as the city understood it. And that knowledge, unspoken, unseen, yet devastating, was the true reason her price surpassed every other. The scandal did not erupt loudly. It seeped into New Orleans the way rot seeps into wood, quietly, invisibly at first, until the structure begins to weaken from the inside. In the days following the auction, the city behaved as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Ships continued to dock along the river. Cotton bales were loaded and unloaded. Music drifted from open windows in the evenings. Yet beneath that normal rhythm, conversations shifted, voices lowered, names were avoided, and when the most expensive woman ever sold was mentioned, it was never above a whisper. Those closest to the city's elite sensed it first. Invitations to dinners were suddenly postponed. Certain doors that were always open became politely closed. Men who once boasted freely of their influence now measured their words carefully, as though every sentence might betray them. The sale had not simply transferred ownership of a woman. It had redistributed fear. New Orleans in 1844 was a city built on contradictions. Publicly, it clung to strict codes of honor, race, and morality. Privately, it thrived on transgression. Relationships crossed forbidden lines. Children were born into shadows. Fortunes were made through illegal deals masked as respectable commerce. The city survived because everyone understood which truths were never spoken aloud. The woman sold at the auction stood at the center of one such truth. The first version of the scandal spread through taverns near the river. Sailors claimed they had heard she was the living proof of a powerful man's hidden life, that she had been raised not in the quarters but inside a grand house, that she had been taught to read, to write, to speak, act like a lady because someone had once believed she might pass unnoticed among white society. These rumors painted her not as property but as evidence. Evidence that could shatter carefully constructed lies. In more refined circles, the story took on sharper edges. It was whispered that her former owner had not sold her out of necessity, but desperation. That letters existed, correspondence that could expose decades of deceit. Bank transactions hidden under false names. Children acknowledged privately, but denied publicly. Alliances built on secrets rather than trust. If such letters were ever seen by the wrong eyes, entire families could be ruined. The idea that a woman, enslaved, silenced, legally powerless, could hold such leverage terrified the city's most powerful men. Slavery depended on the illusion of total control. To admit that someone like her could threaten that control was unthinkable. And so the scandal was not addressed openly. It was managed. The auction itself now appeared in a different light. What had seemed like competition was revealed as coordination. Several of the bidders had known each other well. Some were business partners, others were bound by marriages, debts, or shared sins. Their frantic bidding had not been about acquiring her. It had been about ensuring she ended up in the right. Hands that could be trusted to keep her contained. The winning bidder, whose name circulated carefully but rarely aloud, was known for discretion. He owned remote land. He kept few close friends. He was not the type to invite attention. That was precisely why he had been allowed to win. The price he paid was less a victory than a responsibility. He had bought more than a person, he had a problem that needed to stay buried. As this realization spread, the tone of the whispers changed. The scandal was no longer hypothetical. It was active, dangerous, alive. People began to re-examine past events through this new lens. Old arguments, sudden departures, unexplained deaths, situations that had once seemed isolated now formed a pattern, and at the center of that pattern was the woe. Man whose sale had forced these memories back into the light. Some claimed she had once been seen at gatherings where enslaved people had no place, that she stood behind curtains, listening, that she carried messages between rooms, overhearing conversations meant only for equals. Knowledge gathered over years, unnoticed, unguarded. In a society obsessed with hierarchy, her presence had been overall, precisely because it was unthinkable that she could matter. That oversight was the scandal's most dangerous element. It suggested that the city's carefully maintained order was fragile, dependent on denial rather than strength. If one woman could expose so much simply by remembering what else had been ignored, the fear was not just of what she knew but of what she represented. She was PR. That intimacy across forbidden lines had consequences that could not always be erased. Proof that wealth could not fully control truth. And proof that silence, once broken, could never be fully restored. The men who felt most threatened responded, as they always had, by closing ranks. Conversations were redirected, allies reassured one another, a collective decision formed without formal agreement. The woman must disappear, not physically, but socially, historically. She would exist only as property, stripped of any past that gave her power. Yet even as these efforts intensified, the scandal continued to pulse beneath the surface. Servants noticed changes in behavior. Overseers received unusual instructions. Letters were burned. Records altered. All of it only deepened suspicion. If there was nothing to hide, why such urgency? Among the enslaved population, the story took on a different meaning. To them, the scandal was not about elite reputations, but about possibility. The idea that one of their own could inspire such fear unsettled the accepted order. It suggested that knowledge, memory, and presence could be forms of resistance, even without rebellion. Her silence enforced by money and distance was itself an acknowledgement of her power. The city's religious leaders sensed the moral tension but avoided addressing it directly. Sermons spoke vaguely of temptation and secrecy, of sins that corrode the soul when left unconfessed. Congregations listened, uncomfortable, wondering who the words were meant for. No names were spoken, but many felt accused. As weeks passed, the scandal evolved into something more abstract but no less potent. It became a shared anxiety, a pressure point everyone avoided touching. The woman herself was rarely mentioned now. Instead, people spoke around her, careful to reference the event without acknowledging its cause. The silence was maintained not by force, but by mutual understanding. And yet, silence is never complete. Late teen night, in private rooms, some men confessed their fears to trusted companions. They wondered aloud what might happen if the woman spoke, if she escaped, if she died under suspicious circumstances. Each possibility carried its own risks. A living secret could be controlled, a dead one could provoke questions. The safest option was containment, quiet, distant, absolute. That understanding revealed the true nature of the scandal. It was not centered on immorality alone, but on vulnerability. The city's power structure had been exposed, if only briefly, as something that could be threatened by a single voice. And in a system built on domination, that was intolerable. The woman had become a mirror, reflecting back the hypocrisy of a society that claimed moral superiority while relying on exploitation and deceit. Her existence challenged the narrative that slavery was orderly, justified, and complete. The price paid for her was the cost of restoring that narrative, at least on the surface. But beneath the surface, the damage lingered. Even years later, those who remembered the auction spoke of it with unease, not because of the cruelty, it was cruel times, but because it revealed It showed that the greatest threat to the system was not rebellion or violence, but truth. And that truth, once glimpsed, could never be fully unseen. That was the scandal hidden behind the sale. Not a single shocking act, but the collective realization that power, when confronted with its own secrets, was willing to spend any amount to preserve the illusion of control. And in doing so, it exposed just how fragile that control truly was. After the hammer fell and the crowd slowly dispersed, the woman did not linger in the auction house. There was no dramatic farewell, no final glance back at the platform where her fate had been sealed. She was led away through a side passage, away from the street and the stairs, as though the city itself wished to pretend she had never been there. By the time most people stepped back into the sunlight, she was already gone, absorbed into the machinery that had purchased her so efficiently. What followed was not immediate brutality as many expected, but something far more unsettling: absence. Her name never appeared in public records again. No notice of transfer was published, no advertisements mentioned her, in a city obsessed with documentation, where every transaction was carefully recorded. This silence was deliberate. It was as if the moment she was sold, she ceased to exist as a public person. The winning bidder did not take her to one of the bustling plantations near the city, where labor was visible and routine. Instead, she was transported quietly, under cover of night, away from the river and the markets. Witnesses later they saw a carriage leaving the city without markings, traveling toward a remote stretch of land far from prying eyes. No chains clanked, no guards shouted. The journey itself seemed designed to erase attention, to move her like a secret rather than property. On the estate where she arrived, life followed unfamiliar rules. There were no overseers barking orders at dawn, no fields waiting for her labor. Instead, she was housed separately, in quarters cleaner and more secure than those of the other enslaved people. She was watched closely, but not beaten, restricted, but not humiliated. This strange balance, comfort without freedom, revealed the true intention behind her purchase. She was not meant to produce wealth, she was meant to remain contained. Those who encountered her on the estate sensed the tension immediately. She was allowed to move within limited spaces, always observed, always accounted for. Conversations around her stopped abruptly. Instructions were delivered carefully, as though each word mattered. Even the enslaved people who crossed her path understood that she was different, not favored, but dangerous in a way they could not. Name. The only spoke to her daily was formal, restrained, almost cautious. There were no threats, no promises. The power dynamic was enforced not through violence but through inevitability. She was reminded subtly, constantly, that escape was impossible, that the world beyond the estate had no place for her. Yet she was also reminded that as long as she completed, her life would be preserved. This arrangement confused many. In a system that thrived on cruelty, kindness felt unnatural. But kindness, in this case, was not mercy, it was strategy. Bruised bodies attracted attention, dead bodies raised questions. A living, silent woman solved problems quietly. As months passed, her disappearance became complete. In New Orleans, the whispers faded, replaced by newer scandals, fresher rumors. The city was skilled at forgetting. Those who had been most anxious after the auction slowly relaxed, reassured by the lack of consequences. Nothing had been exposed, no letters surfaced, no names were dragged into public shame. The system, it seemed, had worked. Yet on the estate, time moved differently. The woman settled into a routine defined by repetition, isolation. Days blurred together. Seasons changed. She was given books occasionally, carefully selected, nothing that might inspire ideas of escape or rebellion. Reading was permitted, but conversation was limited. She was allowed to think but not to speak. This isolation was its own form of punishment. Silence pressed in from all sides, heavy and relentless. She could not share what she knew. She could not confirm or deny the stories whispered about her. Her truth existed only inside her, growing heavier with each passing year. And in that silence, something dangerous began to form, not rage, but clarity. She observed everything. She learned the rhythms of the estate, the habits of those who guarded her, the moments when attention wavered. She listened when visitors arrived, catching fragments of conversation that slipped through closed doors. Even in confinement, information found her. It always had. Those who believed she had been neutralized misunderstood the nature of knowledge. Silence did not erase what she knew. It preserved it. Occasionally rumors reached the estate, talk of political shifts, economic pressures, rising tensions between North and South. Each change reminded her that the world beyond her confinement was not static. Power structures shifted, alliances fractured, secrets that once felt secure grew vulnerable over time. Her owner aged, his confidence diminished. What had once felt like control began to feel like maintenance, an ongoing effort to keep the past from resurfacing. He invested heavily in ensuring her continued obscurity, but even he understood that no solution was permanent. The greatest irony was that by hiding her so thoroughly, he preserved her significance. Had she been treated like any other enslaved woman, her story might have dissolved into the countless forgotten lives of the era. Instead, the effort to erase her ensured that traces remained: missing records, altered documents, unexplained expenditures. Absence, too, leaves evidence. For the enslaved people on the estate, her presence became a quiet legend. They spoke of her cautiously, sharing fragments of her story in hushed tones. To them, she was not a symbol of privilege, but of danger, the kind that came from knowing too much. Her confinement served as a warning and a reminder that the greatest threat to power was not physical strength, but awareness. Why? Years passed. The woman aged, though slowly, carefully. She was protected from harsh labor and violence, but not from time. Her youth faded, replaced by a calm resilience that unsettled those who watched her. She had learned patience, and patience made her unpredictable. There were moments when it seemed the city might remember her. A sudden investigation, a rumor revived by a careless comment. Time, the estate tightened its grip, increasing surveillance, reducing contact. The response was always swift, revealing just how fragile the silence remained. Eventually, even the most powerful men involved in the original scandal began to die. Generations changed. Sons inherited estates without fully understanding the secrets they protected. The woman became a burden passed down quietly, an obligation no one wanted but dared not release. By then, her story had transformed. What began as a scandal became a liability. Those responsible no longer feared exposure for themselves, but for the legacy they would leave behind. The woman's continued existence was proof that their past choices had consequences that could not be undone. In the end, her disappearance from public life achieved its purpose, but at a cost. The truth was not destroyed, it was suspended, waiting, locked away with the woman who carried it, aging alongside her, gathering weight with every year it remained unspoken. History would later search for her and find only gaps, a record of an extraordinary sale, a price that defied explanation, and then nothing, no trace of where she went, how she lived, or how she died. Those gaps would raise more questions than answers, ensuring that her story, though silenced in her lifetime, would continue to haunt the past. That was what happened after she was sold. Not freedom, not redemption, but a carefully constructed disappearance. one designed to protect power, preserve lies, and prove that, in a world built on control, the most dangerous thing a person could possess was not rebellion but memory. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest events, but it does not erase them. It buries them beneath layers of routine, distraction, and selective memory. Long after the woman vanished from public view, New Orleans moved forward, convinced it had successfully sealed a dangerous chapter of its past. Streets were renamed, buildings rebuilt. Generations grew up unawed that one of the city's most unsettling truths had been quietly locked away. Yet history is never truly silent. It waits. Decades later, when the institution of slavery collapsed and the old social order fractured, scholars began to sift through what remained. They studied auction logs, plantation accounts, personal letters, and ledgers yellowed by age. At first, the woman's story appeared why as an anomaly, a single line in an old record, a price written so high it seemed absurd. There was no accompanying explanation, no follow-up sale, no record of labor, illness, or death, just a number floating in isolation, daring anyone to explain it. Historians are trained to distrust coincidence. When something does not fit, it demands attention. And the more researchers searched, the more EY noticed gaps clustered around that single transaction. Documents that should have existed were missing. Correspondence abruptly stopped. Names associated with the auction appeared again and again in unrelated scandals, financial irregularities, and sudden relocations. What looked at first like an isolated event began to resemble a deliberate pattern of erasure. Private letters provided the real cracks in the silence. Found tucked away in family archives, never intended for public eyes, they spoke indirectly of a matter best resolved quietly and a burden that must not resurface. No names were mentioned, but the timing aligned too perfectly to ignore. These letters revealed fear, not the fear of rebellion or economic loss, but the fear of exposure. They confirmed what rumors had long suggested: the woman had been sold not because she was expendable, but because she was dangerous. The truth historians uncovered was not neat or complete. It rarely is. Instead, it emerged in fragments, each piece unsettling on its own, devastating when combined. The woman's price was not tied to productivity, fertility, or skill. It was tied to containment. The money paid for her was compensation, not for ownership, but for silence. That realization reframed everything. Slavery, as brutal as it was, depended on the myth of total dominance. Enslaved people were supposed to be voiceless, interchangeable, forgettable. The woman shattered that myth simply by existing in the wrong way. She had moved too freely between worlds. She had seen too much. She remembered. And memory, in a system built on denial, was a threat more serious than violence. The city's attempt to erase her revealed something darker than cruelty. It revealed insecurity. Those in power did not trust the strength of their own system. They feared that if the truth behind her existence surfaced, it would expose the hypocrisy at the heart of their society. Relationships denied publicly. Children erased from family trees. Wealth accumulated through moral compromise. The woman was not the scandal. She was the proof. What makes her story especially haunting is how effectively the erasure worked. There were no public trials, no dramatic confrontations, no confessions. The silence held, not because it was just, but because it was convenient. And convenience has always been history's greatest enemy. As the years passed, the people most directly responsible for the scandal died. Their estates were divided. Their descendants inherited names without understanding the weight behind them. The secret survived not as a clear narrative, but as an absence, a shadow cast by missing information. And that absence became its own form of evidence. Modern scholars now understand that the woman's story represents something far larger than one life. It exposes how systems of power protect themselves, how truth can be priced, transferred, and buried. How silence can be enforced without chains or whips, simply by making the cost of speaking too high. Her erasure also forces an uncomfortable question: how many similar stories never left even a trace? How many lives were manipulated, hidden, or destroyed to preserve appearances? The fact that this woman's story survived at all is not proof of transparency but of failure. The system could not erase her completely. In recent years, historians have become more willing to confront these uncomfortable truths. They read between the lines of official records. They examine what is missing as carefully as what remains. And in doing so, they have begun to restore the woman's significance, not by reconstructing every detail of her life, but by acknowledging the violence done to her memory. There is a certain cruelty in knowing that history remembers her only as a price, not a name, not a voice, just a number written in ink. Yet even that number speaks volumes. It tells us that at one moment in time, a society was forced to confront the value of its own lies, and it chose to pay dearly to keep them intact. The truth history tried to erase was never just about her identity. It was about the fragility of power. It was about how easily moral authority collapses when examined too closely. And it was about how those who are denied voices can still shape the narrative simply by existing in ways that defy control. Today, her story challenges us to rethink how we understand the past. It reminds us that archives are not neutral, that silence is often intentional, and that absence can be as revealing as presence. It urges us to listen not only to what history tells us, but to what it avoids saying. The woman's life, stripped of freedom, and then stripped of memory, exposes the ultimate violence of slavery, not just the control of bodies, but the attempted control of truth. Yet the fact that her story still resonates proves that truth is resilient. It bends, it hides, but it does not disappear. In the end, New Orleans did not succeed in burying its conscience. It only delayed the reckoning. The woman remains unnamed, her voice unheard, but her impact undeniable. She stands as a reminder that the past is not finished with us, and that every attempt to erase truth leaves behind a scar that time cannot fully heal. That is the truth history tried to erase. Not a single scandal, but a system so afraid of its own reflection that it paid a fortune to silence it. And in doing so, it ensured that the silence itself would one day speak louder than any confession ever could.